Hello, guys. Good morning. The Federal University of Fronteira Sul is pleased to welcome you to the activities of the third day of the 12th Symposium on Environmental Science and Technology, second International Conference on Environmental Science and Technology, promoted by the postgraduate program in Environmental Science and Technology. The theme this year is Irreverent Times, Interdisciplinary Dialogues. We now welcome to lecture B Professor Maria Picar Rodrigues. This professor holds his PhD in Geography from the Humboldt University of Berlin. She studied environmental science in Spain and completed her master's degree in geoformation in Netherlands. She also worked in Australia a data analyst and completed 2 years postdoctoral period in Argentina and 2 years postdoctoral period in Germany at the Freie Universität, where in March 2022 she held the chair of Modeling Human Environment Interactions at the Institute of Geography. Her research and understanding the socio-ecological system of the earth and how the alteration due anthropogenic forces impact the social environment will bring biocultural agricultural regions, including the role of policies and the transborder influence. Professor Maria is also the coordinator of the Global Health Program, Social Ecological System of the Earth in Latin America. Professor Maria, welcome to your symposium and this is wonderful lecture. Orbiter, bienvenida. Good morning, Professor.
Good morning. Thanks so much for this invitation. When possible, if the slides can come up, that will be great. Well, I'm here today to give you a brief overview of what we do in our team. I work at the Department of Geography, as the presenter already introduced me, and I lead the group in modeling human environmental interactions. But as you can see here, the work that I bring today, it's a very collaborative work with several colleagues and many institutions with whom we have been working now for about 2.5 years in the region of the Atlantic Forest, of the Alto Paraná of the Atlantic Forest. And I'll be giving you an introduction to that. But I would like to start with a brief background on what I'm going to be talking about today. So I'll tell you a bit about what land systems are and what do we refer to when we talk about land systems or social ecological land systems, why we are focusing our efforts and work in the Atlantic forest of the Alto Paraná. Why is it so diverse? Some of you know very well because you are coming from this region. And why is it so interesting to study these interrelationships from the social and ecological aspects in this region? And this will be a great introduction for us to understand the differences in conservation approaches in this region as well. Okay, but let me get started with a concept that we use among some geographers that study processes that occur on the land, on land systems, and how do we define this system. So the science behind studying all this is a land system science. It's a subdiscipline of geography, we could say, and we deal with studying the land cover. So what is it on top of the earth, right? Do we have water or agriculture or forest? And the land use. So how do humans use this land, right? So here I bring you an example of a forested land within a specific patch which has been deforested, very likely for cattle ranching activities. So what we are observing here is a land use change, right? So these are terms I'm going to be mentioning along this presentation. And as you can imagine, so we work pretty much in rural areas, and agriculture and intensive agriculture are very important activities that lead developments and landscape changes in the region. And they come They bring often improvements in life or in the development of regions, such as increasing jobs or local development, specifically developments of roads or schools, education, and so on. But there are other impacts, such as, for example, on nature, that are felt on the biodiversity side and the potential loss of biodiversity. If we think on deforestation processes for the expansion of agriculture, for example, it is an important driver of biodiversity loss. And what I wanted to exemplify with this graph is the fact that often we tend to refer to climatic changes as those driving big biodiversity losses, but actually in the work of Maxwell, published some years ago, he was pointing out, or they were pointing out, the importance of agricultural changes actually as big drivers of biodiversity loss. But together with that, there are other important impacts on nature, arising from very intensive agricultural practices, such as the fragmentation of natural habitats, the degradation of vegetation or soil, or the pollution of natural resources, right? And I bring you an example here also on main products that are, in this case, coming from agricultural activities. On the top rows, we see two of them, and the relationship to greenhouse gas emissions related to what kind of activities, right? So in blue, so in dark blue, we can see greenhouse gases emissions on the x-axis related to land use changes in the production of some agricultural commodities, right? Which is also interesting. But there are also all the important impacts on the society. And here I'm referring other trade-offs that come with the development of regions. Not to say that, of course, agriculture brings many developments, but also some trade-offs and drawbacks on that, such as potential impacts on health or pollution, or impacts on access to resources for those communities that depend on natural resources. Yeah. And I bring you today the perspective of a frontier region. And I have concentrated my work in the last years understanding frontier regions, because I think they're fascinating. And from an interdisciplinary perspective, they bring many challenges, but they can be used, and when I talk about a frontier, it's often an administrative frontier, right? So a region that lays between different countries. And they are interesting, they're very interesting, because they set up frameworks for comparison, different management approaches in every side of the frontier, on the different countries, for example. And specifically, this is what we term, I forgot to say that, this is what we term a natural experiment, right? So imagine you have a specific ecoregion, and we can use the one of the Atlantic forest, so between Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina, what originally was everything Atlantic forest, but the different countries start managing their parts of the country within the ecoregion in different ways, right? So this is going to translate into the shaping of landscapes in different ways, right? So this is something we did in a study that we published 4 years ago. We compared the national ecoregions of the entire South America. So we said where are borders shared by different countries within the same ecoregion. And what you can see here, they are the lines differentiating different countries, such as, for example, I hope you can see my cursor, but we have here the Gran Chaco, the dry Chaco in gray, between Bolivia, Paraguay, and Argentina. And you can see that there are some thicker gray lines differentiating the shape of the countries within this same ecoregion. And in this study, we calculated how different or similar special attributes were in the different sides of the border, meaning that the thicker the line, the more different the attribute was on one side of the border and on the other side of the border. So more specifically, we looked at attributes that relate to the management of regions, such as, for example, protected areas in Bolivia and versus Argentina, or protected area or fire management practices comparing Bolivia versus Argentina, right? We also use nighttime lights to get a feeling for where there's more population or more activities. So out of this exercise, what we observed was that the Atlantic forest, so the triple border in the Atlantic forest, so what refers to the Alto Paraná region, was one of the most asymmetric borders in the entire South America. And that's one of the reasons why we decided to focus in this region. And I bring you here a snapshot of the study area that we're using in our studies. And where you can see in yellow, right, the border of the actual ecoregion, but in white, the borders that we have used for most of our studies. And why we are enlarging this region? Well, in order to be able to include social data, often we have to look at census data, for example, and we thought that including municipalities would be a good idea. So that's why through this presentation, when I refer to the area of the Alto Paraná Atlantic Forest, I'm going to be referring to this extended ecoregion area, okay? So some of you may know already that this is a really highly biocultural region with really high rates of biodiversity, nowadays concentrated in small and more isolated patches of native vegetation. And as I said before, is the triple border of the entire South America with the highest land asymmetries. Yeah. So to give you a bit of an idea of how land use has been developing and land cover as well in this ecoregion, we started analyzing with the help of Mary Jo Generich. She did her master studies with us, and I'm depicting her here in a photograph. She analyzed the land use maps by mapiomas for the entire ecoregion, and I bring you here a comparison from 1985 to 2023. And what we see here, as we depicted in yellow, grassland activities, in pink colors, agricultural activities, in green forest, and in blue water. And what we can observe is an important expansion, also reduction in forest in the Paraguayan side. So here we are in Paraguay, right? Here we are in Argentina, and here we are in Brazil, okay? So if we compare the 1985 map with the 2023, what we observe is that there was an important reduction in the forest area, in the green area, especially in Paraguay, and an important conversion between yellow to pink, right, we could say. And this translates into conversions from pastures to crops, yeah, and this occurred mainly in Brazil, but also in the eastern parts of Paraguay, okay? So this translated into important losses of native natural cover in about 27%, and as you can imagine, rural inequalities due to agribusiness pressure. Yeah? So as I mentioned before, this diversity of land uses and the important dynamics of land use conversions generated important land conflicts. And this is something that Alberto Anticoli, also from my group, investigated for his PhD, where he did a literature review of the diversity and of actors and associated land conflicts for the entire Atlantic forest. This is what we see now in this image. So here, this part we have Brazil, and this part we have Paraguay, and in this little part we have Argentina. And he geolocated the results of this literature review, which included scientific articles, but also gray literature, also reports, for example. And as you can see, there are different colors accounting for the different amount of sources that he included. But most importantly, what you can see is that these colors, which relate to the highest amount of conflict, again concentrate in this area of the Alto Paraná Atlantic forest. Yeah? What he concluded from his study was that there is a series of conflicts occurring, but mainly those perceiving this conflicts were mainly rural communities, small agricultural producers, and conservation NGOs, sorry. And those influencing the conflict, so tracking this conflict, were often multinational, state agencies, and international cooperation organizations. So I think until now you could grasp a bit the concept of land systems. So when we talk about land systems, we often refer to very complex systems that integrate the different dimensions of human and the environment and the different processes that occur spatially, where interdisciplinarity is very important, plays a very important role. And that's why we often tend to work in big groups, because for us, it's very important to include the different perspectives of the different dimensions of the human environmental interactions. Yeah. So from this perspective, something that we often use as a framework of reference in our works is the concept of social ecological systems. And I think this diagram depicts very nicely the concept itself, where the human system interrelates or interacts with the ecosystem via means of actions or interventions, and this often has an impact, often on the environment, but also on people. And this interrelationship brings also benefits for humans, but also hopefully for nature, that we can term in terms of ecosystem services, for example. And this has been a concept which was coined around, we can say, the mid-second decade of the 2000s, of the 2020s, sorry. So around 2015, 2017, researchers started talking about this socio-ecological systems or land systems as this concept for interrelated interactions. And specifically for Latin America, there is a reference paper that we also work often with that started conceptualizing all these different interactions, and I bring it also here for you today. But from the geography perspective, and more recently, a new concept evolves from this original social ecological system, which is the land perspective, the geographical perspective. It's very important to understand these interactions, but for us, for geographers, it's really exciting to understand where these interactions are happening and where these impacts are located. And that's why we started to work with the concept of social ecological land systems, but also develop methodologies towards moving towards the mapping of these interactions. And the reasoning behind arises from one line of thought or several disciplines which started to wonder or willing to move away from dichotomic approaches. You have on top the ecoregions of the world, yeah, and which mainly look at environmental boundaries, so environmentally homogeneous units, right? This is the definition of ecoregions or biomes of the world, versus the administrative areas, right? We have below the map of administrative boundaries. And these both tend to separate the world in a dichotomy, right? Whether if we could look at it only purely administratively or only purely environmentally. So environmentally, but also administratively, we have plenty of data available at these two different scales. But we started wondering, what about the integration of both, right? So a first approach in this direction were the anthromes by Earl Ellis, which started including the use of natural areas in such a mapping approaches. Yeah. And we took it a little bit further to start characterizing these social ecological land systems, which looked at description or looked at attributes that intersect the social and environmental dimension, even the political dimensions, to the entire South America. We did this exercise some years ago, and started mapping and characterizing complex systems, but in a spatial way. So you can imagine that we use big data sets that are spatially explicit, but that cover both dimensions, so the human and the environmental. And why am I telling you all this? I need a bit of water. Well, because we also did this exercise for the Alto Paraná of the Atlantic forest, where we compile a set of variables covering the biophysical realm, as you can see there, such as slope, precipitation, distance to rivers, for example. Also the land cover and the land management, where we included forest cover, pasture cover, everything in maps, right? So from a spatially explicit perspective, also economic data on production. We have here cattle, let's move, or cities, travel time to cities, and socio-cultural variables as well, such as population or the location of indigenous communities. So after compiling this big database, which was mainly also enriched by constant feedback with our collaborators. Yeah, we asked them often which are the variables most important for you to be included in such an exercise. That's why we compiled this list. We selected them and generated a clustering algorithm, which is like a spatial grouping algorithm, which groups those variables that are more similar to each other, but in a stack way. So imagine you have maps for every of these rows, yeah? So for slope, for precipitation, for pasture, you have all these maps, and this grouping algorithms questions what is here, what is here, what is here, and starts comparing, yeah? So it groups regions which are more similar to each other in terms of all these variables, yeah? And once we have resulting maps, and I'm going to be showing you one, we went back to our local experts and collaborators to see what they thought, and we started over again. Sometimes we had to revise variables and define new variables and do this grouping again. We did this at an hexagon level. These are detailed, and this is how the map looks like. It's one of the very important results of Alvid Trumper, who is also doing her doctoral research in my team. And as you can see here, and what I think is so interesting is that we are looking at one single ecoregion, right? Our starting point is one single ecoregion, so an environmentally homogeneous area, and 3 countries, right? But here you cannot distinguish that well in some regions the country border. In some other regions you can, for example. So you hopefully can see that this pink socio-ecological land system is shared between Brazil and the east of Paraguay, but it's not the case between the north of Paraguay, the Atlantic forest, and Brazil, or, for example, between Argentina and the rest of the countries. So here there is some differences at the country level, but some similarities between countries as well, right? And to give you an idea of the different terminology of how we ended up naming and terming this socio-ecological land systems, I bring you some examples here. So for example, in red, we have native forest landscapes with heterogeneous productive matrices with low population density. In this blue, we have historically transformed landscape with heterogeneous productive matrices with increasing anthropization, or this pink, lighter pink group, we name them as consolidated intensive agribusiness landscapes with high anthropization shared between Paraguay and Brazil. Okay, and if there are questions to that, we can come back to questions at the end of the presentation. So we have seen that from these socio-ecological systems, there are interesting patterns which make the differentiation between countries bigger, but some similarities between countries also exist, right? So then we were wondering, very curious to know, how are these asymmetries or these differences in conservation between the different countries, the three countries of the Alto Paraná? This was the first objective that and now we're getting into the topic of the conservation asymmetries, right? So this was the first topic that we researched, but was also very interesting for us to understand whether there could be potential trade-offs between conservation and human development in these three countries. So something that we did again in the framework of a research day by the Argentinian researcher Lia Monti, who works for CONICET. She was 1 year with us in Berlin and worked in this project. She's an ecologist by training, but she was retrained into these interactions of the human and environment mainly. So again, she compiled a very large database, as you can see here, on four main important topics: on land use and land cover. And there we looked at deforestation trends or connectivity index, biodiversity intactness of the region. Also on land cover, where we had again water area, cropland area, soybean, for example, demographical and cultural variables such as migration, international migration, the age of the cities or population, and some economic data regarding the size of fields, for example, education or healthcare facilities and or accessibility. So what she did with this large database, which in this case was not especially explicit, she had a large table of data. She calculated differences between pairs of countries. So, for example, how is the water area between Argentina and Brazil, or what we have here, population between Paraguay and Brazil. So comparing these pairs of data and using Euclidean distances, I brought here the equation, but not for me to describe it, but just for you to know that this is a way to do a comparison of asymmetries or differences or similarities. And that's how she calculated these asymmetries between pairs of values. Yeah. So what I bring you here, and you can is this Euclidean distances on the x-axis between the different pairs of the countries. Yeah. So how was the different value of variables here clustered, right? We grouped for economics in gray between Argentina and Brazil, between Argentina and Paraguay, or Brazil and Paraguay. How we interpret this is as follows. Yeah. So the larger the wider the bar we see here, the higher the difference that we have. Yeah. So we could say, for example, because the green bar relates to conservation, we could say that between Brazil and Paraguay, there are not so many differences in terms of conservation. Okay. As opposed to, for example, demographic and cultural, we have it here in purple blue. Between Argentina and Brazil, there are more differences, yeah, in terms of demographics and cultural variables. This is how we interpret these graphs. And as I said, this is by grouping all these different variables and the main big blocks, but we could go a bit more in detail. And I know this seems a lot, and I'm going to be focusing in only one example for today, okay? But we have in green the conservation variables, right? In yellow colors, the land cover variables. In bluish colors, the demographic and cultural values, colors. And in gray, brown colors, variables related to economics, okay? So, for example, let's pick up patch size. So we had patch size is this green here, and I think it's remarkable and interesting that between Brazil and Paraguay, there are very few or very small differences in the size of patches of natural cover. Yeah, this means that the average patch size of a forest patch between Brazil and Paraguay is very similar, but between Brazil and Argentina is much higher, and between Argentina and Paraguay is also high. Okay. If we look at the land cover variables, we could focus in the soil variable, which is yellow, this one here, and we would see a similar pattern. So Brazil and Paraguay share a similar amount of soybean between the two countries, as opposed to their partner country with Argentina. Argentina has much less soybean in this case than Paraguay and Brazil. If we move to our demographic and cultural in blue, we could concentrate in, oh, this is small for me, sorry, I have to, yeah, population density in light blue, where we see that there are more similarities between Brazil and Paraguay and Argentina and Paraguay than between Argentina and Brazil. Okay, when we look at the thickness of the bars. And finally, for our economic variables, we could concentrate in the health facilities, this pinkish variable here, where we can observe that between Argentina and Paraguay, there are more similarities in terms of how many health facilities are there, as opposed to with Brazil, for example. Okay. So, but overall, these results are interesting, but still very important to frame them within an historical context, right? The three countries have followed a different historical development, and in those terms, so in the very past, colonization powers by the different crowns, Portuguese and Spanish crowns, have shaped very much the structures of the landscapes for managing territories, cultures, and languages. And this is very important to acknowledge, right? That even if this asymmetries is what we see today, they already have an inheritance, right? In the past, the War of the Triple Alliance also shaped importantly the demographics of the region, with Paraguay experiencing a demographic collapse. And this was felt in other arenas, such as the political and economic arena. And this we carry an inheritance on until today, right? And this has impacted the economic development and the governance of the different regions, right? So all this has given rise to different patterns. So this economic development, specific patterns of trends that we believe are a bit common on higher population densities in some regions, and therefore higher deforestation in some regions for this extracting resources. But more specifically, we could, more specifically, and coming a bit more towards a current context or more towards the present, we also observed how the three different countries manage the regions differently, since Brazil perceived or gave this region a development frontier role, preserving other regions such as the Amazonia, and extracting more resources. And we also saw an important expansion of agricultural activities here, against what Argentina did, that although, in Argentina, there are two interesting processes. First, it became an official province, or it was colonized relatively late. So it became a province in the 1950s. And this delayed the human and environmental impact of the region, right? But, and it has been also pictured and preserved as an important touristic attraction of Argentina, and therefore today it contains about 50% of Argentina biodiversity. Okay, and for Paraguay, we see similar patterns than what happened with With Brazil, it has been in the last years also used or depicted as an emerging development frontier. And although Paraguay enacted the zero deforestation law in 2004, claiming zero deforestation in the Atlantic forest, deforestation continued due to some legal gaps that existed. And nowadays, Paraguay lost 50% of its forest, plus the deforestation, which did not occur in the Atlantic forest side, was displaced to the Chaco areas of Paraguay, for example. But a bit more background or specifics on what is behind the developments of Brazil and what we could see in this work was that crops and livestock expansion were important, and even very important before the 85 when we started studying this, right? That's why in our data set, we did not depict large expansion of agriculture in Brazil because this occurred before the 80s, right? An increase in migration and intensified energy demands. There are, as you know, many hydropower plants in Brazil, specifically along the Paraná River. In Argentina, besides the perennial crops such as yerba mate, for example, and a small-scale cattle farming and some industrial forestry, the continuous forest cover has been preserved thanks to this conservation-oriented tourism that I mentioned before, but also because Argentina chose to develop other regions. In this case, the Pampas and the Chaco experienced important agricultural expansion developments in the past. And in the case of Paraguay, Paraguay experienced a fast urban expansion and then in selective logging for hardwood species and important fire conversions from forest for cattle ranching and crop production. But at the same time, this region in Paraguay is home to numerous and important original communities, and therefore the arising conflicts in the region. But in the last 5 minutes, more or less, that I have in this presentation, I would like to come back to our last objective that we had for this work, which related to potential trade-off conservation, for the potential trade-offs between conservation and human development. And this brings us closer to this discussion of conservation asymmetries, whether conservation brings any trade-offs on the development of humans or not, under the premise that potentially a higher GDP may contribute to a higher, what we have here, Human Development Index, so HDI for Human Development Index. And therefore, we could assume that this would come with an associated lower conservation, yeah? So we could think, okay, if regions are more developed, economically developed, because the GDP is higher, people may live better, may have a higher HDI, Human Development Index, but therefore they need to use the environment and the natural resources for this, and therefore the conservation of the region may be lower, okay? So we did a small exercise and looked at what is the GDP per capita and per parity price in the beginning of the 2020s between Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay. And we saw that meanwhile, Brazil and Paraguay had a GDP, a very similar GDP of about 12,000 or 13,000 US dollars. Argentina had it slightly lower. So according to our hypothesis that we write up here, according to this hypothesis, Argentina could have a lower Human Development Index, but therefore more conservation, right? A better preserved area. And this is something I've been pointing at before, right? I've been talking that Argentina preserved a lot of the forest cover because for tourism and other purposes. So this is something that we could expect, right? And what we did here was to compare two indices that we created using the variables that we saw before. One conservation score in the x-axis, which contains all the conservation variables that we looked at before. and a human development index or human development score, which mixed some of the variables between the economic and the demographic and cultural blocks that we looked at before. Okay, and what we see here is that meanwhile Paraguay and Brazil have a similar conservation score, so similar degree of conservation. They still differ in their human development, with Brazil having better human development quality or higher than Paraguay. But surprising to us, Argentina showed up. This was not surprising. We would expect Argentina having the highest conservation score. This was not surprising at all. But what surprised us was then Argentina arose as a region with a high human development index. So this for us was interesting because it challenges ideas or previous ideas or the previous hypothesis that we were trying to test, right? And points at the need, and I'm highlighting this here, points at the need for moving beyond GDP measures and including more inclusive development measures. Yeah? Not that only economic measures are not enough for measuring, or only economic indicators or scores are not enough for measuring the developments of regions, right? So overall in this presentation, and this is just to close the presentation of today, I hope I could convey the message that conservation operates between the ecological and social dimensions, and it's very important. So when we look at or thinking conservation, the human dimension and the historical context of the regions play a very important role, and therefore the importance to balance these benefits and needs, and the importance of bringing integrated visions into the conservation of land systems, where human development, sustainability, and biodiversity variables should always be included. And an important take-home message that I brought in one of the last slides is the possibility for conservation and human development to coexist, but the need to rethink development indicators and shape development priorities towards integrated visions. Yeah. So with that, I'm really thankful for your attention and for the invitation of today. And I remain open for potential questions.
Thank you, Maria, for your presentation. As always, very, very nice, very inspiring. I believe this topic of conservation asymmetries is very broad and interesting for our audience. And we have for sure many challenges, and I believe your group, also yourself, because I know you work in field here in South America, probably have a lot of challenges along these years. So congratulations for your team and for your great effort. So now we are moving to questions. We have a lot of questions, I was saying, so I will be like looking for some of them if we have time. So first question is from Gabriele Zanetti. She says, excellent lecture. Dr. Maria, how do variations in environmental legislation among these three countries influence conservation outcomes in your perspective?
Thanks, Gabriele. This is a very, very important question and something that we tackle in our research today. I gave only a glimpse of what we're doing and the importance of institutions and legislation in shaping these conservation outcomes. But very briefly, together with that, not only legislation, I would say priorities for development, right, at the country level. So I mentioned in one of the last slides how, for example, Brazil put the focus on preserving different regions and having environmental laws with a really strong focus on preservation in different regions at the Atlantic forest. And the Atlantic forest was targeted as an expansion and development frontier in terms of, well, as you all know, agricultural activities, urban development, clean energies projects as well, hydropower projects. The same occurred with Paraguay, which allowed a great deal of developments in the 80s and 90s in the Atlantic forest. And when Paraguay realized that the developments were very uncontrolled occurring, and most of the forest, of the Atlantic forest, was being lost, then they enacted this zero low deforestation for the Atlantic forest, so the eastern part of Paraguay. And this stopped deforestation. But in this case, in the case of Paraguay, they were legal loops and legal holes that could be used to continue deforestation in the region. They have another law which not only allows but incites people to actually expand the agricultural frontier further and deforest for that. It's allowed. Yeah. So then farmers have found and lawyers have found legal gaps in legislation to move further with deforestation. And we have on the other side Argentina, that decided to protect a lot of the forest in this region. So they have the national park, they have two important protected areas, provincial parks as well. And this shows the willingness of countries and regions to shape the developments and the landscapes of the region. So important topic indeed.
Yeah, thank you. Also, I think it's worth to mention that these legislations always like changes across time. Yeah, so this could also be a factor.
Indeed, yeah, very important point. And the historical context as well, how we start with what kind of development.
Yeah. So I have another question from Nicholas. Professor, excellent lecture. I have a question. Is the creation of protected areas sufficient to mitigate the impacts, or are broader socioeconomic policies necessary?
Thanks. Also a very key topic in discussions and related to conservation, definitely. Nowadays, I mean, there are different also dichotomies on the approaches for conservation. I guess you're familiar with the concept of land sparing and land sharing and how this shape landscapes. I would say that protected areas are very important, but in integration with the protection of smaller patches and more heterogeneous matrices that allow a diversity of services to be preserved. Yeah, and when I mean services, I refer to, for example, cultural services. Yeah, the maintenance of knowledge, the maintenance of traditional agricultural practices associated with an important agrobiodiversity. We shouldn't forget the agrobiodiversity richness of the region, right? And protected areas are not exclusively preserving this. And I think there's a cultural heritage that preserves an important biocultural diversity in the region that is only possible to be preserved when we look at landscapes in a shared way and management practices that include this as valuable areas to be preserved. Yeah. So in that sense, I will advocate for maybe both sharing and sparing all together. Yeah. Thanks.
Nice. So another question from Caroline Fazzolo. My question is related to the selves regarding the historical exploration of the landscape and local communities. What are the major differences between the countries?
For the different cells, the map of the cells, we saw, for example, an importance on Brazil having really high connectivity and accessibility in terms of accessibility between regions or health facilities, or the accessibility to health facilities. Population density was also an important factor depicting, let me remember, for the Atlantic forest in Paraguay is very densely populated, and there also the usage of fire is very high and important and different to Brazil and Argentina, for example. mainly because Paraguay has been expanding the agricultural frontier in the since the early 2000s. And as I said before, in Brazil, this was very much established. So already in the 80s, a lot of the developments in Brazil already occurred. Yeah. Then we have a differentiation with Argentina, where there are many protected areas, as I mentioned before. And then, so the expansion of agricultural commodities was also important and more similar between Brazil and Paraguay than in Argentina. And that's why we see this important pink cluster or pink group that is shared between Brazil and Paraguay, and very differentiated from Argentina. Argentina has very little soy. Yeah. So these are some of the attributes that we're differentiating. Also water. Water was also important, like the amount of water shared by the different countries.
Yeah, nice. So we have a lot of comments also congratulating your speech. So Roberta said, good morning, your research is inspiring and give us a more accurate view of reality. The study of all the associated variables is admirable. Congratulations.
Nice, thanks.
So, okay, now we have another question from Roberta. Is the late colonization in the Argentinian region associated with any specific factor like soil type, topography, culture of the regional populations, or with a combination of variables?
Very good question, Roberta. Indeed, a combination of variables, of course. So, as you know, the main colonization of Argentina started through the port of Buenos Aires, and therefore reaching the further regions and the harsher regions, right? These are forests which are very dense. So to reach there, the region was harsh. You had to go through landless areas, as it was described before, right? Which were also with not so many resources until then. And that's why it was colonized much later. I don't think it had nothing to do with soil, but the far-reaching, and the difficulties of being reached from the original expansion of colonizations in Argentina.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for another 2 questions. Yeah. So one more from Bianca. Congratulations, Professor Maria. In your opinion, how can the results of land use and land cover guide the improvement of legislation and public policies in the countries evaluated?
I can read again. The results of land use guide the improvement of legislation. Okay, I mean, 2 ways, right? So legislation impacts land use, but at the same time, when we see the results of the impacts of land use on the landscape or deforestation, it's time for policies to adjust. Sorry. Again, depending on the target developments of the countries, right? So as we saw, Argentina prioritized the conservation of the region because for Argentina was clear that it is a really highly biodiverse area. And that's why I think in our case, the study that I brought today, the interesting part of integrating variables can be very informative for shaping political strategies, because it also highlights the need to have this integrated views and not isolated views of what is good for humans, what is good for the environment, but integrate everything together to shape policies. Yeah, because often we tend to think that economic development cannot come or coexist with the preservation of natural values. But slowly, there are more and more studies that point at the fact that it is possible. And again, political strategies and legislation play an important role, but as long as they start to be more integrative. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So we have our last question. As I mentioned to you before, if you have another questions, we will send you by email. So last question from Arthur. Fantastic lecture. Are there any successful examples of transboundary cooperation in the region of Alto Paraná, and what made them work?
Okay. Yes, very interesting, and there are. I would like to bring the example of the alliance, the Restoration Alliance of the Triple Frontier, which is an alliance brought by WWF, so WWF Brazil, WWF Paraguay, and Fundación Vida Silvestre Argentina, so the Foundation for the Wildlife Argentina, which is the equivalent to WWF Argentina. They have an important project going on in the Triple Frontier with restoration projects. So the three countries are investing. They have pilot projects, and they've been working now, I think, for a bit more than a decade, if I'm not wrong. Into the first, they focus quite a lot on restoring the natural areas of the jaguar corridors. That was how everything started. And now small farmers and private landowners are joining the initiative to start restoring their lands as well. And I think this is a very successful, there are still pilot projects and small scale projects, but I think this is a good example of a very successful international cooperation into the conservation of the region.
Yeah, thank you. I think the major efforts between countries should be the restoration of areas and the connectivity of the environments.
Yeah, it goes towards that direction, indeed. Yeah.
Okay, so once again, thank you, Maria, for your wonderful lecture.
My pleasure.
It's a pleasure to have you here again with us. And for those who are listening to us, we have the banner presentations in the afternoon, and we also have the last talk, the last lecture in the evening. So we invite everybody to come, and that's it. See you guys later. Bye.